In this video, we're going to go through how to use Jenkins along with AWS Copilot to deploy an application to AWS App Runner. Are you new here? If you are, welcome. And if you are new here, you don't know who I am. My name is Darren Pope, and I'm a developer advocate for CloudBees. You may have watched a previous video about using Docker Compose to deploy to Amazon ECS. As we go through today's video, we're going to go at it a little bit differently. AWS provides a CLI named Copilot that interacts not only with ECS, but also one of their newer features that's called AWS App Runner. We're going to be taking the Copilot CLI, marrying it with a Jenkinsfile, running that in Jenkins, and we'll be completely building out our environment and deploying our environment using that Jenkins file. Let's talk about the tooling that we're going to be using today. Today we have a Jenkins LTS controller that's version 2.289.1. When it was created, we used install suggested plugins, and we also installed one extra plugin, and that plugin is the AWS Credentials plugin. If you haven't watched the video about AWS Credentials, go and watch that right now. The link to it should be right up here. Now for our agent today, we are using a Mac-based agent. Right now I'm running macOS Mojave. You can be running any version that will support both Copilot and Docker. Now you might be questioning, okay Darren, why do I need Docker if I'm using Copilot? Copilot under the hood uses Docker to build images for you. And since we're going to allow Copilot to build our images today, then that means we have to have Docker installed. Also on our Mac today, in order for me to be able to connect from my Jenkins controller to the Mac, I had to go into System Preferences and go into Sharing and then enable Remote Login. Now, I'm going to leave that up to you to figure out, okay, what are the right people that I should allow? What is the right account? Whatever that is for you. For me, I am allowing anybody that's in the administrators group locally, and my credential happens to be in that group. Finally, let's take a look at how our agent is configured, because if you've watched any of our previous videos, this is just a little bit different. So let's go down to our agent and go to our configuration. Now everything up to this point is sort of normal. I created an agent directory, in this case specifically an agent 123 directory, or 1234, inside of my user home directory, which is users/dpope. The big change for this, unlike other videos I've done in the past, is I needed to make a modification to my path environment variable. And the reason why that I needed to add this user local bin is because the Docker binary as well as the Copilot binary were both installed using brew, and brew puts all of the symlinks into user local bin. So in order for those binaries to show up and to be used, at least on my machine, I needed to prepend user local bin in front of the existing path that is on this Mac. And before we get into the actual jobs, let's go back over to our Mac. So I'm sitting right here on my Mac. Let's take a quick look at Docker -- version. At the time of recording, the latest version of Docker. If we take a look at Copilot, and Copilot's also at its latest version at the time of this recording. Now the application that we're going to be using today is out on GitHub, and you can go find it under my name, Darren Pope, and it's just java-web-app. Now, what you'll have to do in order for these things to follow along is to take a look at the Copilot branch. There are multiple branches within this repository, so make sure if you're following along, make sure you select the Copilot branch. Before we get started, let's take a look at the Docker file and understand what we're building. This is a multi-stage Docker file. So we're just doing a normal pull from adopt OpenJDK. We do our Maven W build, and then finally, when we do our packaging for the final image, we do our copies from our build image, and then our actual execution of the demo application. One more thing before we move on. Since this is using Copilot, there is a specific folder under our application directory called Copilot. The name of our service that we're going to be creating is web, so that's the reason why we have a name of web. And then within that, we have a manifest YAML file. And this is set up to where the name is web, so that references back in the path, so that's just a naming convention. The type that we're using is a request-driven web service. Now, this is an alias for AWS App Runner. If I was going to just use AWS ECS or Amazon ECS, as it's better known, then I would have just used, I believe the phrase is load balanced. So again, if you want to figure out what all the definitions are for the manifest YAML, I'll leave that up to you to go through the documentation to understand how Copilot generates these manifest YAMLs. But we can see right here, the image that we're going to do, we're going to build based on our Docker file that we just looked at, and we're exposing port 8080 because that is the default port for our Spring Boot application that is packaged within that Docker image. A couple more things here real quick. We're using 1024 CPU and 2 gig of memory. So as we get started, let's go ahead and create a new item. I'm going to name it Java Web App Copilot. I'm going to name it Pipeline. Click OK. I'm going to switch this over to SCM. Git. Paste that in. Change my branch to Copilot. And change my script path to Jenkinsfile -1. Now let's go and take a look at our repository to understand what we have in Jenkinsfile 1. We actually have 3 Jenkins files within our Copilot branch of this repository. And for Jenkinsfile 1, all that we're doing is just running Copilot version and Docker version just to make sure that we're actually able to see the output from those 2 commands. So let's go back over here and click Save. And then let's do a build now. And as that starts up, we'll click into it. We can see it's green. And we can see that Copilot was version 180, which is what we saw when we ran it by hand. And also we see that Docker version is 20.10.7, which is also what we saw when we did it manually. Now that we know that we're able to access Copilot and Docker without any issues from within Jenkins inside of a job, let's go and take a look at Jenkinsfile -2. And with Jenkinsfile -2, we have a much more expanded version of what we're doing. So we're going to add some credentials. One for AWS credentials. We're interacting with AWS, so we need credentials. That's also why we're using the AWS Credentials plugin. Then I have this keychain password, which under the hood is a secret text. The reason why we have a keychain password is because we're running on Mac OS, there are some functions within Copilot and really within Docker that need access to the keychain. So what we're having to do is unlock the keychain and then we lock it back up at the end. So we're passing in what is the keychain password. Now for me, the keychain password is my login password. So that is a secret text. It's just a single value. That's all that we need to do that. If you're running on either Windows or Linux, you won't be using this specific command, but there may be other commands that you need to run. That's going to be up to you to figure out. Then we run our tooling version, and then we run a deploy. Now, if you have not worked with Copilot init at all, go and take a look at the documentation. The link to all of the Copilot documentation is down in the description. And this walks you through the different parts and parameters that you can pass in. We're going to name our application DP test. Our name is going to be web. Now this web maps back to our Copilot web manifest YAML. So this web is the web that is defined in that manifest. This type is a request-driven web service. The Docker file that we're building is our Docker file, and we're also going to say deploy. So when this command runs, it will create an ECR registry, sort of redundant, but it'll create an ECR registry to push the image into, and then all of the App Runner infrastructure will also be created, and that image will be deployed into App Runner, all within this single line. Once this is complete, then we lock up the keychain. So let's go and modify our job and change it from Jenkinsfile 1 to Jenkinsfile 2. So Jenkinsfile 1 to 2. Now let's watch what happens. Let's click on Build Now. Wait for it to wake up. It failed really quickly. Why did it fail? You know what? We never created our credentials. Let's go create our credentials real quick. So Manage Jenkins, Manage Credentials. Here we go, Add Credentials. So first credential, AWS Credentials. The ID for our AWS credentials is going to be, let me find my notes. Here we go. So it's Darren Pope, AWS Creds. I have an access key. And I have a secret. And what I'm going to do with the secret, I'm going to tab out. And these credentials are valid and have access to 6 of it. So I know my credential is good to go. So I'm going to click OK. One more thing. I'm going to create my secret text for my keychain. So ID, description, and the secret is actually my password. And click OK. All right, good. Now we have our job. We're ready to go. Let's do a build now. See what happens with 3. Okay, 3 wakes up. And no parameters, that's normal. So here's our security chain unlock. Here's Copilot and Docker. And now we're into our Copilot init. This is where we're going to use the magic of video to fast forward through the next few minutes. Now that time has elapsed, we can see here at the end, we have a URL. Let's open up this URL in a new tab. We can see here that it says Hello World. In fact, let's go ahead and just make that really large to make it simple. So Hello World. And if you were to take a look at our application, we can see that from source, main, Java, demo application, we can see that based on root, we're just serving back Hello World. So that worked as we expected. Now, let's move on to the next step. What we just looked at in our Jenkins file for Jenkinsfile-2 was a Copilot init. And that was the only step, really, that was doing anything specifically with App Runner. So everything was happening through this init. Now, you could go back and run init every time, but you may not want to. There may be numerous reasons why you don't want to, probably from a performance reason, because every time you run this, it doesn't recreate new things for you because it's able to figure out based on, under the hood, it's doing CloudFormation. So CloudFormation is figuring out any differences and then applying those differences. So you could safely run this each and every time, but it does take longer. So what we want to do is we want to be able to just deploy changes to our service, which is the web service. So how do we do that? Well, let's go back over and take a look at Jenkinsfile-3. With Jenkinsfile-3, we've added in a couple of variables that we're going to carry throughout this pipeline. And really what we're trying to do here to begin with is we're trying to figure out, does the DP test application exist? So if I do an application listing within Copilot, so Copilot app ls, if dp-test is found, then it's going to be true. Otherwise, it will be false. So if we find dp-test in our grep, that means the application already exists. If dp-test already exists, then we assume that the service already exists as well. Could we do a better check for this? Absolutely. Is this good enough for a basic example? Sure. So we're checking to see, okay, does the application exist? Yes. Then, if the application does not exist, using this when conditional, so when not exist, application exist, then we're going to run Copilot. If we've already run Copilot init, then application will exist. So then what we're going to check for next is if not initial creation. So on initial creation, we're going to skip Copilot service deploy. Now what Copilot service deploy does is it will do a build and a deploy for our service, in this case named web. So we have two variables that we're tracking. We have an application exist and an initial creation. Both of these are set to false on start of the pipeline. If a Copilot init runs, then the initial creation is set to true, which means we would skip this because the service would have already been deployed within Copilot init. If for some reason that the application has found to already exist based on our figuring out at this point, specifically around 31 to 33, then Copilot Service Deploy will run. So what we're going to do first is we are going to make a change to our job and say, okay, let's change it from -2 to -3. Click Save. And then let's go ahead and click on Build Now. And watch what happens. So we're running number 4. We can see here that we're doing our grep. The application exists is set to true, so we skip our initial deploy. That skips the Copilot init stage. And then we go into Copilot Service Deploy, name Web. So we go through all the build parts here. So going. They already exist. But here's the interesting part. There were no new infrastructure changes found for dptest test web. So since there were no changes to our image and there were no infrastructure changes, then once it got to this point in service deploy, it just stopped. And it's like, there's nothing for me to do, so I'm just going to stop. And then the job finished. So let's go ahead and make a change to our application. And let's just change Hello World to Hello World. Let's say for the service change. Okay. Let's add this and commit this up. Change. And let's git push. And what we will do is we will do a quick check up here within our repository. Make sure it's there. Demo application 15 seconds ago. Yep, that should be it. Hello World for the service change. Now, let's go back one last time and let's build our job. So we're still using our Jenkinsfile -3 version of our Jenkinsfile. Let's see what happens. So we found it. So that means we skipped it over and went to Copilot Service Deploy. We're building our image because there was a change to our image. So let's get down through our image. We are way behind here. So let's see if I can catch up a little bit faster. There are so many lines. Let's see here. Okay, here we go. So we're doing our build. There we go. Now we're caught up and watching it live. Now we're pushing up the image as it's being built, or as it has been built. And since we had a change in the image, the infrastructure changes, there are no real infrastructure changes other than this image. So let's watch what happens here. We can see here now that the app runner service to run and manage your containers is an update in progress. Notice there isn't anything else going on. So in this case, it's just updating the service. It's not recreating the service, it's updating it in place. So let's watch the rest of this play out. Okay, now it's finished deploying. We can see that this is the same URL that we had before, 4TPR. So we'll go back over here. You can sort of see it 4TPR. Let's refresh this. And there's the change that we just made, already deployed out to our AWS App Runner service. So by using a combination of the Copilot CLI provided by AWS and then mirroring that along with Jenkins, we were able to build a very basic Jenkinsfile that can take care of completely initializing an environment for us to use with AWS App Runner, but we're also able to make it just smart enough to figure out, okay, if I've already initialized it, let's just keep updating the service as it stands. Now, if you were doing something like a monorepo and you had multiple applications within that repository, you would structure things a little bit differently. But in the case to where we have a basically one-for-one repository to application, We have a Copilot manifest in there, specifically in our case, Copilot/web/manifest YAML. We make all of our definitions there. So when Copilot starts up, it's using that manifest YAML to build out the environment. And then as we go on, it's also using that manifest to also keep track of what services we're running. So Copilot makes it simple for you to manage an AWS App Runner or even using Amazon ECS. Take your pick. If you have an image and you just want to run it, those are two options for you to use within the AWS ecosystem, and you're able to orchestrate it using Jenkins. If you have any questions or comments, you can reach out to us on Twitter at CloudBeesDevs. If this video was helpful to you, give us a thumbs up. And if you haven't subscribed to CloudBees TV yet, why not? Take a moment, click on that subscribe button, and ring that bell, and you'll be notified anytime there is new content available on CloudBees TV. Thanks for watching, and we will see you in the next video.